Be'ez Hashem, we are going to start learning the ha-Goyis l'Dibra Maschil Posach Liyol Tofresh Nun Ches. So this is a very significant rishima, kuntras, set of notes that the Rebbe Rashab wrote on the famous maamer, the Alter Rebbe Posach Liyol, which is printed in the Sefer Torah Ohr. And these notes were written and completed rather in the year Tofresh Nun Ches, 1898 or possibly earlier 97, in the winter of Tofresh Nun Ches. Now, the purpose of what we're going to talk about now is a hakdama, is an introduction to try and understand the context and the importance of this kuntras, and why I think it's significant we should be learning it. But in order to do that, we have to get to 1898. To get to 1898, there's a few stages. So what I plan to do is to discuss generally the origins of the original maamer and the Sefer Torah Ohr, the nature of writing ha-Goyis and notes and emendations like this by the Rebbe Rashab, its discovery of these notes and its and the publication of these notes. That's going to be one sort of chronology, one history that I want to tell. And a second important set of information I want to share is about the Sefer ha-Zohar. It's based on a maamer ha-Zohar, the Posach Liyol from Tikkunei Zohar, and I want to help you understand the nature of the Sefer ha-Zohar and the associated books. So the Zohar, Tikkunei Zohar, Zohar Chadash, there's lots of different things surrounding the Zohar, and it's important you should know what they are, because you're going to have it, many times you're going to have quotations from different parts of the Zohar, and it's good to know where everything fits in. And then I'm going to say a few words, not too much, because that's going to be for the beginning of the next year, about the actual teichen, the content of the material, and why it's so important. But a lot of that I'll leave for the actual, the next year when we actually start learning. So let's start with the nature of the Alter Rebbe's Torah. The Alter Rebbe hardly wrote anything himself. Of course, you have the Sefer HaTanya, which he published in his lifetime, which he wrote, and that was the only thing that we had in writing officially from the Alter Rebbe. Now, of course, there were copies of his maamerim, so he would give maamerim regularly, and there would be those would be written down, and that would be disseminated and dispersed. So people would have versions of the Alter Rebbe's Torah, but as official publications, there was only the Tanya, and that came in various stages. You had the original Tanya, which was just the first and second parts, the Tikkunei Zohar and Shaykh Emunah, and then later Igeres HaTshuva was added, and then posthumously you have the Igeres HaKodesh and the Kuntras Achron. So you only have the Tanya, and the Seder was that the Alter Rebbe had a lot of manichim. He had quite a number of people who were writing down his maamerim. Chief among them, and who would sit, on right next to the Alter Rebbe when he would say Chassidus, was his brother, the Maharil, Rebbe Yehuda Leib, and Reb Pinchas Rezus. But in addition to them, there was also the Alter Rebbe's sons, the Mittler Rebbe, Reb Doiber. There was Reb Moshe, who would also write Hanachos. Plus there was his Talmud, Reb Aaron Strashella. Plus there was his grandson, when he came of age, who was also writing things down, the Tzemach Tzedek. And presumably there were others too who would write. So there were a lot of manichim. There were a lot of versions of the maamerim. So you can imagine that the different manichim had different styles, and therefore the maamer would have been processed through different mindsets and different personalities and different approaches to the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus. And there ended up being quite a lot of versions of the Alter Rebbe's maamerim. But again, none of this was published officially. During the Alter Rebbe's lifetime, the Tzemach Tzedek was already trying to create a seder and an order of the Alter Rebbe's maamerim, and with an eye on printing them. And many of his sort of collections of hanachis, of transcripts of the maamerim, the Alter Rebbe himself looked over and sort of was magia himself. So there's an element of the Alter Rebbe being involved in the publication of these maamerim. But the Alter Rebbe. So the Tzemach Tzedek would be, the Tzemach Tzedek was working on organizing the hanachis in order to publish them, and the Alter Rebbe had a chance to look over them, some of them, and so there wasn't an attempt to publish these maamerim. However, it didn't happen at that time. And then you have the Istalkus, the Alter Rebbe, in Tofresh Ein Gimel. Now, the Mittler Rebbe chose to publish 2 volumes of the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus. He published in Tofresh Ein Vov, so 1805, 1806. He published 2 volumes. He published the Siddur in Dach, the Siddur with a Siddur which had with it the maamerim the Alter Rebbe on davening, and then you also had the Bi'urei ha-Zohar of the Alter Rebbe. Now, he writes very clearly that the Bi'urei ha-Zohar, for example, were maamerim that weren't said publicly. These were maamerim that were said in private to his children. So there'd be maamerim the Alter Rebbe would say privately to children, sons, even his daughter, and those were the sort of the maamerim which the Mittler Rebbe collected and edited, and they were his own hanachis. They were the transcripts which the Mittler Rebbe had written, and he published these 2 volumes. So by this time you only have 3 volumes of the Alter Rebbe's Torah. You have Tanya. This is besides for in Nigla. I'm talking about in Chassidus. You have Tanya, to publish in his lifetime, and then in the Zman of the Alter Rebbe, in the Mittler Rebbe, Tofresh Ein Vov, in Tov Kuf Ein Vov. Tov Kuf Ein Vov, 1805, 1806. You have the Siddur and you have the Bi'urei ha-Zohar. And the Mittler Rebbe himself published a lot of Svarim of his own Chassidus. But the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus, that's what he had. So
whilst he was still alive?
The Mittler Rebbe?
Whilst the Alter Rebbe was still alive?
No.
There was only one book.
You said in 1806?
Sorry, 1816. So 1815, 1816. I'm getting my years wrong. Yeah. Tovkuf Ayin Vov, 1815, 1816. Sorry, I apologize. The reason I was getting confused because the maamer Pasach Liyol was said in 1805, Tovkuf Samach Vov. But we'll get to that in a second. Yes, so after the Istalkus of the Mittler Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek becomes Rebbe. And the Tzemach Tzedek had this long ambition to publish his grandfather's maamerim, and he'd already prepared an amount, but he was still working on the different hanachas. Now, the hanachas that he worked from, obviously some of the hanachas, he was too young himself to have any of his own hanachas. He couldn't have any transcripts because some of the maamerim that he was going to publish, before he was even bar mitzvah, before he was 10. You have even from before Peterburg. So he didn't have his own, and he relied very heavily on the hanachis of the Maharil, which was supposed to be quite very exacting. But in the later years, he had his own hanachis, and he put together a collection on Bereshis and Shemais, and he published it in the year Tovkuf Tzadik Zayin, 1830. 36, 37. I think it was Shvat. I think it was published in Shvat, so it would have been 37. I think if you look on the actual first edition, it says 1836, but it's Tovkuf Tzadik Zayin. He Abreishis Shmois. Now these Maimorim, these collection of Maimorim were written in a style where it was very close to the Alter Rebbe's Lashon, and there was very little additions from the Tzemach Tzedek himself. Even though the Tzemach Tzedek had written his own notes and hagoyis on the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim, Bichlal was not, wasn't so was hardly any additions from the Tzemach Tzedek himself. They were the Maimorim as they are. Quickly. Not relevant. Please leave. And so he published. Now, after this time, there was problem with the publishers, and a lot of the Russians closed down a lot of the publishing. This was published originally in Kapust. By the time it got to publishing Vayikra Midbar Devarim, Kapust had already been closed down, and it was going to take another close to over 10 years till the Tzemach Tzedek could finish. The idea was to print it in 2 volumes. Volume 1, Torah Ohr, was going to be Bereishis Shmois. Volume 2, Torah Ohr, was going to be Vayikra Midbar Devarim. But everything changed in between, and already by this time the Tzemach Tzedek felt, for whatever reason, didn't just publish the Maimorim as they were in the Hanacha, but also with his addition, with his hagoyis and with his edits interspersed inside the maamer, usually in brackets, in different styles. And so in Tofresh Ches, so in 1848, the Likutei Torah was published. So the Likutei Torah is a very different style than the Torah Ohr. Even though they're seemingly 2 volumes of the same project, they come in very different styles. Because you have in the Likutei Torah, you have not just the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim, you have the Alter Rebbe's Maimorim with the notes and the additions of the Tzemach Tzedek. Obviously not all of them, because he has his own Maimorim on that, which was published separately later in Eira Torah. But you can see very clearly the Signon Haloshin, the style, is very different in Torah Ohr to the way it is in Likutei Torah. Okay. In Tofresh Chaf Beis, towards the end of the Tzemach Tzedek's life, this is 1862, he published the Torah Ohr again, a second edition of the Torah Ohr. And there was a possibility that he could publish it in the same style as the Likutei Torah, with all of the additions, the hagoyis, and to make it more fulsome in the way that it is in the Likutei Torah. And however, it didn't happen. There are a few hisafis at the back, and there were some emendations. Things were changed a bit. There were some additions, but it was kept pretty much the same, without it being transformed into the style of Likutei Torah. And so it never happened. In the time that Rebbe Maharash decided that he wanted to produce a sort of a Likutei Torah on Torah Ohr, to take the Maimorim of Torah Ohr and expound upon them with hagoyis, with notes, and sort of and to explain them in the style of Likutei Torah. So it should be to complete the project in a sense. So he prepared hagoyis and notes on the first 3 parshiyos, Reishis, Noach, and Lech Lecha. And the goal was to publish it. It all got very complicated. This is a very peculiar story. Ultimately, it didn't get published until after he passed away in Tofresh Mem Daled. The person who was in charge of publishing it was a relative who went to Vilna, didn't really do the job properly. The Hasidic Kapust managed to infiltrate the whole project and switch around some of the manuscripts. It ended up getting published in a style that was, on the front page it said, these are the hagoyis of the Rebbe Maharash. It basically had the Rebbe Maharash's name was on the front page, and they took out the Rebbe Maharash, a lot of the Rebbe Maharash's chassidus, and they put in the Tzemach Tzedek's instead. And then they said, look at this, going around claiming it's his own chassidus, he's just plagiarizing this, our father, our grandfather, the Tzemach Tzedek. And it created a whole storm. This is known as Likutei Torah Legimel Parshios. So Sefer Likutei, and it just basically, we have the original and it's published somewhere, but it became like sort of a very unhappy and unpleasant affair, and it flamed the machlekas between Chabad Lubavitch and Chabad Kapust.
It's always them that do the bad stuff, eh?
Them.
In our record.
That's part of this. That's part of the story.
In which year was it published? Eventually.
Tov Reish Mem Dalet. So this was in.
84.
This is 1884. Yeah, summer, or probably the summer of Mem Dalet. And that's the Likutei Torah Legimel Parshas. The Rebbe Rashab, who was now Rebbe, or at least in the early stages as Ibn Nasias, in the year Tov Reish Nun Beis, in 1892, decided he wanted to write Hagois on Parshas Vayera, which starts with the maamer Pasach Eliyah. The first maamer of Torah Ohr for Parshas Vayera is the maamer Pasach Eliyah. So he started in Tov Reish Nun Beis. And he did a thing about, you'd say about a quarter of what we ultimately have, he wrote them, but then he stopped. For whatever reason, he stopped. He only started the project. There is an assumption that he wanted to carry on his father's project. His father did on Bereshis Nayich Lech Lecha. The Rebbe Rashab was going to go on and do from Vayera. He started and then he stopped in the middle of doing the first maamer. And it was only in the winter of Tov Reish Nun Ches that he came back to it and did the rest. So that's why it's known by the year Tov Reish Nun Ches, 1898 or possibly 97. All we have is from the Frierdiker Rebbe's note. The Frierdiker Rebbe writes that it was in the winter of Tov Reish Nun Ches. Now, this was never published. It was kept private and it was just kept to himself. This Rishim, it's in his own, amongst his writings. There was
Did he manage to complete?
So he only completed the first maamer.
Vayera.
Only the first maamer of Vayera, not even the whole parsha. He finished the first maamer, and then he left it. He didn't continue the
That
project.
was a quarter of this, or the whole thing by now?
But the whole thing.
Okay.
And this remained a reshima by the Rebbe Rashab. There was a bachi in Temchi Tmimim called the Rebbe Avram Paris, who was had a big cheshek and taiva for Limud Chassidus, and he became aware that there was such a reshima, that this maamer, the Alter Rebbe Pasach Eliyah, had hagois of the Rebbe Rashab, and so he managed to arrange to steal the manuscript, and he, together with Reb Chaim Lieberman, who later became the Masker, the Frierdiker Rebbe, Reb Chaim Lieberman was the one who transcribed it. He copied it, and once he finished copying it, he put back the original. So they had a copy of the Hagois, and they made a whole bunch of copies, and they shared it, and it got spread out amongst the Bachrim, and everyone was told to be quiet about it. It was a secret.
Which year? Around what time?
Would have been the late Samachs, Ayins. I can't remember what year. I don't know.
You got it from the Frierdiker Rebbe or
From the Rebbe Rashab.
Rashabi?
It was in Lubavitch. And so, but eventually the word got out. The Frierdiker Rebbe got, who was the Manal Poel, who was in charge of the yeshiva, found this out, and he punished them. Chaim Lieberman was not allowed to eat in the yeshiva for a week, and about what Avram Paris's punishment we don't know. It just says he got a worse punishment. It doesn't in the book Echad HaYavram, it doesn't say exactly what his punishment was. I don't know. And however, when the Frierdiker Rebbe mentioned it to the Rebbe Rashab, Tovei Alav Bracha, Alavai more would be like this. More would care about Chassidus so much that they would steal it. So there was a copy of these Hagois that were available. People had access to this material. But it wasn't till Tavshin Mem Aleph in 1980, Chaftala Tevis Tashmim Aleph, that it was actually published from the original Ksav Yad, from the original manuscript of the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe instructed them to publish it, and it got published in Tafshim Aleph, and that's what we have now. Obviously, there were many more editions after that, and now there's this new edition from Toshin Tes, which has all the Mari Mekemis and is nicely laid out. Now, these Hagoys of the Rebbe Rashab are on the maamer, the Alter Rebbe Pasach Liyah. Now, the maamer Pasach Liyah was said in the year Tov Kuf Samach Vav. Vayera Tov Kuf Samach Vav, 1805. And it's extremely Yesodistic maamer. Extremely, profoundly important maamer in the development of the unique style of Chassidus Chabad, that explains the Inyoni Kabbalah, Dafka in the style of Chabad, and as we're going to see as we learn it, the maamer is an explanation of the Pasach Eliyahu, the Psicha de Eliyahu, which is found in the Tikkunei Zohar. Now, let's just say a few words about the Sefer ha-Zohar and where this fits into the Sefer ha-Zohar. Because when you learn Chassidus, you have a lot of references to Zohar, different parts of the Zohar, and it's good to know the general makeup of how the Sefer ha-Zohar works. So the Sefer ha-Zohar, as we have it, came to public awareness in the 13th century. And it's Yidua, how many people, researchers into it, claim that's its provenance, that's where it was written then and it was developed then. But we have the Masorah that it comes from the Rashbi, and the majority of it is statements and sayings of Rashbi and his Chabura. So Chabura made up of about 10 people, of which Rashbi was the head of the Chabura. Now, the Sefer ha-Zohar is structured as explanations on the Pashas HaTorah. So it goes through the Pashas HaTorah. It has Pirushim in the style of Midrashim, but sort of al derech hasoid, obviously. And within the Sefer ha-Zohar, there are sections that have their own names, and sometimes they're quoted by the name of their section rather than just Zohar Pashas this. And I'm going to mention three of those sections that are important to know. There's the Idra Debei Mishkana. This is in Pashas Truma. And here it talks about Inyoni Tefillah. It does Pirushim of the Mishkan, of the Psukim about the Mishkan, and explains Inyoni Tefillah. You have the Idra Rabbah, which is in Pashas Nosei. So Idra Rabbah, usually understanding it's like this. This was a lot of the times the maamer ha-Zohar are just one or two of the Chevraya that are speaking to each other. They're together in a certain circumstance. But the Idra Rabbah is when they were all together, all 10 of them.
What does Idra mean?
It's a good question. Idra can mean a gathering. It can be a goyrin, sort of a setting where they all met. But the Rabbah part, the big one, is because they were all there. It's usually the big gathering. That's how we usually understand it. And so in the Idra Rabbah, you have explanations of the Partsufim, how the Musa Adam, the Musa Kisi, the Musa Kamari Adam. So it explains all of the different Evorim and how they are to be understood about Elikus. You have the Idra Zutta, which is the smaller one, which is in Pashas Ha'azinu, and that describes when Reb Shimon Bar Yochai passed away. That's the description of the Yom Lula of Rashbi. And whereas in the Rabbah, there's sayings from all the different Talmidim, all the different members of the Chevraya. In the Idra Zutta, it's just Rashbi that speaks. So it's his Torah.
So he's describing his own passing?
He's teaching Torah that he wants to teach. And then you have this whole description of his passing away. So those are three sections which are in the Sefer ha-Zohar. But you also have additions to the Sefer ha-Zohar. One is called the Raya Mehemna, which literally means Raya Ne'eman, faithful shepherd, or shepherd of faith, if you prefer. And the Raya Mehemna is a pirush on the Tarig mitzvahs. So in many editions of the Zohar, the Raya Mehemna is included within the Zohar. So when it comes to a parsha where there's a mitzvah, it will include the Raya Mehemna on that mitzvah. Okay?
Who is it written by?
Again, all part of the same thing. You also have something called the Zohar Chodosh, the new Zohar, which is like a hisofa to the Zohar. It's also on many parshas, and it's also on Megillas Rus and Megillas Eicha. And you'll see again, you see quotations from the Zohar Chodosh. That's the Zohar Chodosh. But these are all things in and around the Zohar. And then you have what the Pasuk Eliyahu comes from is called Tikkunei Zohar. The Tikkunei Zohar is 70 pirushim on primarily the first pasuk of the Torah, Bereshis. Explains Bereshis in different ways. But in the Tikkunei Zohar, you have hakdomis, you have introductions. So the first introduction describes all about Rashbi in the cave and how that, and all the elements of the cave that we know about the story of Rashbi is in the Hakdama Rishona of Tikkunei Zohar. Then you have the second Hakdama. And the second Hakdama is in the presence of the whole, I think it's the whole Chevrai. And Eliyahu Hanavi is asked to address the Chevrai Kedisha. And that's where we have Pasuk Eliyahu. So Eliyahu began, Va'ama said as follows: Ribin Almim, Antu Chad V'Lev Chushban, Antu Eloaku Eloim. What does Eliyahu do? Eliyahu Hanavi describes basically the Esespheres. He describes how the Eibishter is Chad V'Lev Chushban, and then the Eibishter has Esespheres, and how that's all manifest. You know, the Pasuk Eliyahu that we say on Erev Shabbos. So that is the context of the maamer of the Alter Rebbe, Pasuk Eliyahu, in Torah Ohr. So, as you can imagine, the purpose of the maamer is to explain the Esespheres of Atzilus, Oiros and Kalim. And in order to understand the Esespheres and the Oiros and Kalim of Atzilus, you also have to understand Tzimtzum, because without Tzimtzum it makes no sense how on earth the Eibusher is able to have Esespheres, and also their relationship with Esespheres of Atzilus, the relationship between them with Eilam Esbiyah. So ultimately you have the whole of Seder Shtalshalos, what's being talked about over here. And the means by which it's understood is through the mashal of a person, a nefesh. The nefesh has Esa Koichis. The person has Seichel Umidos. So the maamer is also explaining the relationship between the Esa Koichis HaNefesh with the nefesh. But the maamer itself is quite a short maamer. In the published Torah Ohr, it's what is it, 3.5 amudim, 3 maybe 4 amudim, if about 3.5, 4, let's say 4 amudim in total. So not a very long maamer. The inyanim are bekitz, although there's quite a lot, but it's very rich, it's very dense, with a lot of material, which ultimately becomes the foundation of so much of the development of the most fundamental and central ideas in Chassidus Chabad. And the Rebbe Rashab, in his Hagois, which number, in total he wrote 34 Hagois. There are 34 notes. Some of them are a few words, just giving a Mari Mokim, referencing a Mari Mokim, and some of them go for 10, 15 pages. So there's a whole range of Hagois. But in these 34 Hagois, the Rebbe Rashab really does analyze in depth every single aspect of the maamer, and lays the groundwork himself for so many of the ideas which would ultimately be more fully expounded upon in Samach Vav and in Ein Beis, and what we're going to see also in some of the most important and sort of profound maamerim of the Rebbe too. So a good understanding or a good appreciation of the ideas being explained in Argois of the Ramasu Pasach Eliyot Tafresh Nun Ches will set a person up, Be'ezus Hashem, for a much richer experience of Limud Chassidus, going all the way back to the Alter Rebbe and going forward all the way to the Rebbe's Torah. So I hope that was a useful introduction, and to set the scene for starting to learn the maamer. As I've said, I recommend learning before we start Perik Nun Aleph of Tanya, especially as it's in Shiurim b'Sefer Tanya, where you have a very important ha-Zohar there of the Rebbe explaining Perik Nun Aleph in Tanya, and which Rabbi Weinberg goes at great length to explain and expound upon, and also to learn the first ois of the biur to the maamer Lisashbis in the Tikkunei Zohar Vayikra Daf Daled Amud Beis. So those are actually the first two references the Rebbe Rashab makes at the beginning of the maamer, and it's a good idea to have that already in place. We're going to learn it, and so yeah, Be'ez Hashem will start soon, and I hope it will be enjoyable. Any questions?
Is the maamer Pasach Eliyot, not the maamer, but this what he said from the Tikkunei Zohar, is that the origin of the marshal of the Adam to explain the Sefer, our whole knowledge of the Sefer? Is it from the Kabbalah Aliyah, or is that?
No, that's the origin.
Everything afterwards is just explanation on this